if I haven't stopped talking at about 10 o'clock, please somebody shut me up. Because it's a great opportunity, and I'm really honoured to be asked by IALTA to talk, especially now that we're on the island of Ireland, and even though I live literally as down south as you can go before the island turns towards America. But it's really nice to come to a conference on a train rather than a plane, so I feel very, very lucky. So I'd like to thank, there's loads of people I really need to thank, I guess, but I certainly thank IALTA and the organisers of the conference. But there's other things I need to think about as well. I wanted to start with a couple of lines from a song. The last two lines I think are really important. They've always, that kind of thinking has always driven me in my thinking, that we decide which is right and which is an illusion. The underlying idea is that we should question everything. We should never be satisfied with what we've done. We should never be satisfied with what we've written or what we've said. We should always ask, where can I move this idea on next? People have often complained to me about how the socio-cognitive model keeps changing over the years. And if it didn't, I would just retire, stop what I'm doing, because nothing should ever be set in stone. So when I see people who are absolutely married to a particular concept that maybe has been with us for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, I think that's really sad. Why are you married to that idea? Why don't you just change the bloody thing? Look at it again, think about it again. Is it actually appropriate? So what I want to do at the end of this talk, I don't care if you don't listen to a single word I say during the next 45 minutes. And I hope we have a few minutes for questions at the end. But there's one idea that I want you to walk away from today with. You'll know what it is when I get to it, because some people won't be very happy with it. But I think if you walk away with that one idea, then I'll have done my job. So how I get there, God only knows, because as you know me, once I start, I can't stop. But before I do that, we've had a long history. I was asked by Jamie to do a talk on the history, past, present, and future of language testing in Europe, and stupidly I said yes. And then I spent the last number of months just panicking, because there's a huge bloody history. It's not just a few years old, it's a massive history. And it's a really interesting history. So how do you boil it down into 40 minutes? And the answer is you don't. You can't. So somebody's going to be upset because I'm going to miss loads of stuff and I'm going to get stuff wrong. And I don't care, because it's just my interpretation. Like with anything I do, especially when I talk about history of testing or anything like that, it's my interpretation of the history of it. And if you don't like it, well, that's your problem. It's not really mine. You can't change my mind. It's too late. I might have changed my own mind by next week when I've read something else, but that's different. But the likes of me, and I hope the likes of you, would not be here without some amazing people. And in my career, I've had amazing people. I've worked with all of these guys over the years in different ways. I've missed people. I thought of this last night sometime late in the evening, so I couldn't find pictures of all the people I wanted, but I did find some of the most important people I know and knew and was lucky enough to work with over the years. So my thinking and my attitude, my whole approach comes from these people. Mainly the guy on the third from the bottom on the right-hand side, Don Porter, my PhD supervisor, who was happily as mad as a bag of cats. He was a wonderful man. He was completely crazy. He had the attention span of a gnat. So he would get an idea, run it with that idea for about 20 minutes, and then have another idea, which was my idea of absolutely heaven and bliss, because he just let me on and do my own thing. But he was an amazing guy. But everybody in that picture, I've been lucky enough to work with. I've been lucky enough to get to know and become friends with. And that's one of the great strengths of IALTA, I think, is that it given us all the opportunity to work together over the years and to think together. So my whole hope today is that we think together, and by the end we'll have had one thought, just one. Normally I would have three, but just one today. Normally looking at me. But most importantly, I want to dedicate today's talk to Jamie, a great friend, a colleague, complete head case in many ways, mad as a bag of cats, but he was our Jamie. And we would not be in British Council where we are today without him. And I'm not sure Yalta would be the same without him either. He was such a driving force. And also one of the most amazing minds in language testing that I've ever come across, who could talk incessantly about any subject. He was just off. And if you asked him in an email to write you a response to something, he'd write half a book. So I used to tell him, Jamie, I don't scroll, just answer the question. You'd have like 4 pages and then the answer to the question. But he was always brilliant. So Jamie, this is for you. Now, what am I going to start with? Yeah. I asked a bunch of people before I did this. I did a survey of some people around Europe. And I asked a very simple question. Well, I asked loads of questions, but one of them was, when did formal language testing begin in your country or region? And that was the response I got. And you can see that most people are saying, oh yeah, it kind of from the 70s on. And I thought, geez, that can't be right. You know, why the confusion? So I went back to my treasure trove of documents. I've been collecting documents on the history of assessment for donkey's years. So this is one of them. Can anybody tell me what this is about? Or when it was written? When the original was written? About. Give me a decade, a century, I don't mind. The key word is in number 21. You give something in the vernacular to be turned immediately into Latin. This actually comes from 1599. It's the Ratio Studiorum from the Jesuits. They'd already been running schools for half a century at this stage and already had standardized teaching and assessment systems in place. This is a translation, which you can find online, by the way, of the book from 1970. And there's some really interesting bits in it. I just took one line. There's a whole section on how the exam should be delivered. So the administration side of the test. So these people, they actually wrote this. They gathered all their own wisdom at the time. So we know that these things were happening, centuries ago. We know that history, it goes right back to that time. So where might it have come from? The earliest quote I had found up to that one had come from this guy, Robert Burton, who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Melancholy, which was philosophizing on the education and the historical and the political situation in Europe in 1621. And in that book he wrote, rectors of benefices to be chosen out of the universities, examined and approved as the literati in China. So of course he was referring to the Chinese imperial examination system, which the Jesuits had brought back the thinking from their travels in the mid-16th century back to Europe. But he was then the person who began people's minds thinking about where this might go. And of course, over the next couple of centuries, we had all of the main brains of Europe then got in behind it, and all of these at some stage in their writings supported this idea of competitive examinations. Now, these things were happening at steps. Somebody talked about yesterday at the AI symposium. They were talking about how things change over time, and how in the past things took quite a long time, and then things began to speed up. We can see exactly the same thing happening with testing, because in Europe things started to really heat up with the scientific movement of the 19th century, where people started to think seriously about measurement. And a lot of my American friends will probably be surprised to hear what comes next, because it started, the beginnings of standardized education in Europe really came, like general population level, in 1763 in Prussia. It then moved on to the competitive examination, the Northcote Trevelyan. I always try to put people's pictures in there so you can actually see these were real people, they're not just names. Trevelyan wasn't a very popular person in the west of Ireland, by the way, because during the famine he wasn't very kind to his people. There's a very famous song about him, which doesn't leave him in a great light. But he was one of the people who wrote this report on the permanent civil service, who introduced the idea of competitive exams for the civil service in the UK, which then spread around the world at some stage. But of course, what really happened around that same time was this guy Galton, you can find his archive online, by the way, everything he ever published, and some of it is absolutely amazing. Like, he discovered fingerprints, he was a geographer, he did all kinds of stuff. He also invented the concept of eugenics, which we now accept as a crazy idea. But he loved counting stuff. You know, he used to go down to the River Thames and he would measure the physical attributes of the guys who used to row the boats in the local races, so that see if he could predict how well their physique matched their performance. He was into measuring stuff. But measuring stuff was the thing of the 19th century. Because around that same time, Wundt in Leipzig was looking at this whole idea of psychology. And he was inventing a whole area of study. And under him, PhD student of his was Cattell, who, when he finished, moved to Cambridge, set up the psychometrics lab. That was the first psychometrics lab in the world. And then a couple of years later, he absconded. He was American, to be fair to him. He went home and ended up in 1891, I think it was, in Columbia University. Columbia University then produced people, his PhD student, Thorndike, his PhD student, Kelly, who crippled us all with the multiple choice item. And that is the first multiple choice item, because that was the example from his first paper, the Kansas Test of Silent Reading, which is it's a brilliant one. Draw a line around the name of each animal that is useful on the farm, which is a brilliant question. Love it. So that was the very first multiple choice question a person would have seen in about 1915 or 16 or something. So around Columbia then you had this whole idea of measurement. So Thorndike came up in 1904 with his scale of handwriting, Hilliégas in 1911 with his scale of composition. So they were into measurement, into standardization, and that's where it started. The Curtis test then put all of their work together into the first standardized test battery in 1915. And around the same time, Titchener was working on the concept of structuralism, which then became linked to the two. And that, out of that was born what Spolsky has called the psychometric structuralist approach, which drove American assessment for many, many decades, and still is one of the main drivers behind a lot of thinking in the US, in my opinion. You get that? Because I'm looking at Eric looking at me down there. You know? Who the hell do you think you are? You know? In my opinion. In the meantime, Henry Sweet was also a measurement person. He was interested in psychology. He was interested in language, but the difference became the fact that he's moved away from measurement into the focus on the linguistic side, the actual language and language in use. And he's considered the father of applied linguistics. And his work contributed to the first significant European test, which was the 1913 Certificate of Proficiency in English from Cambridge, which was wildly successful in that 3 people took it in the first year. And by about the 1930s, that population had multiplied by 10. So over 30 people took it in the mid-1930s. But you can see from that whole thing that we had 2 different concepts now developing on both sides of the Atlantic. Even though the measurement had started in Europe, it moved to America and it bedded into America. Somebody asked me last night, why was that? I said, I haven't a clue, not really. Well, you can imagine that it was the new world, and there was a kind of a single common language that they brought their own languages and cultures, but they were assimilated and used English primarily. In Europe, you couldn't do that because you had multiple languages, so you had different ways of doing things. So people maybe, in terms of language, were far more interested in the actual communication between different peoples from different countries and different regions in Europe, because it was more important, because Americans didn't talk to natives. They just slaughtered them, basically. I shouldn't have said that. But we had 2 concepts coming up. We had the concept of validity as being primarily around measurement, and validity by being primarily around the construct, the actual language that we're looking at. So we had 2 different philosophies of test development. Now, I'm going to forget about the Americans for a while, but I will come back. You never leave the Americans out of the equation, because they were very important. They continue to be important, even if they're wrong. spoken from a European perspective, of course. And that wasn't the thing I want you to walk away with remembering. But it is related to it. We do know that from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, all of these different groups started to develop. And they were generally supported by governments, and many of them were focused both on the language but also on the politics. And their whole reason for being were around soft power. People realized that soft power was replacing hard power slowly, especially with the British Council, for example, was founded in 1934 with the specific focus on soft power, because the British Empire was falling apart. Very dangerous for me to say it up at this end of the world, but happily, as far as I would be concerned, any empire should fall apart. So these groupings were beginning then to move towards something different, because they were building people's understanding and knowledge of language and culture and spreading those around the world. And that happened over a century. You can still see things that was still taking quite a long time. One of the things I asked the guys who responded to my survey was, what made things happen? How did things change over the years? And you can see that in the past people felt that education was the main driver of change. That's how they felt, with politics the other main driver. By the present, that had changed radically. So we had business coming in to a slightly greater extent, society having a far bigger say, so broader general society having a bigger say, and the emergence of technology. The interesting thing that I found about all of this question wasn't actually the answers, it was the fact that the difference between the present and the future is almost non-existent, which is crazy stuff, I think. You know, the future is already starting, it's here, and it's changing. Anybody who was lucky and sensible enough to be at the AI SIG group yesterday will see how things are changing so rapidly. I asked myself then, why white people have these ideas that things started in the area of testing relatively recently, in the last 20 to 50 years, when we know that it's been going on for years before that. And I thought, well, there's a couple of different things that are happening. Number one is the whole concept of accountability. So I looked back into my treasure trove, of course, of documents, and I found the Powys Commission. Now, if you don't know, you probably foreigners, you know nothing about this kind of stuff. So, Powys is the castle where the Clive of India, who was, if you're from the UK, you think he was a great hero. If you're from India, you think he's a great thief. So that's where his family, he became the Earl of Powys after he retired and stole everything he could out of India. He was asked to do a commission in 1870 to look at education in Ireland, because Ireland was a problem. We were a colony, but we were a problem because our students were not performing well on their exams. In fact, only 36% of the students were actually passing any exams. So what was wrong? They decided after 588 pages that they needed to fix the teachers. So they brought in the system of payment by results. Accountability. When this guy's Highland and Milne reviewed the documentation from the period, what year was it, 1987, they found that even at the period, people realized that this was a disaster. It was a disaster because it encouraged rote learning, made no allowances for difference between pupils or between schools, and it narrowed the curriculum. And this was a small warning, because not so long later, 100 and something years later, our friends across the Atlantic had the concept of accountability, and it came in, and when people looked at that, what did they find? And this is from Green, from Forbes magazine, which I think is really interesting. He was able to point out that you had exactly the same thing. It has shifted school resources away from many topics not on the test, narrowed the curriculum. You had exactly the same problem. So warning number one of the day, avoid accountability testing as much as you possibly can. It's a failure. It failed in Ireland in 1870. It's failed in the US in the last 20 years. So don't be moving in that direction. So that was one of the the negative sides of political interference. On the positive side, we had the Council of Europe, which since its foundation in 1949 has had a strong focus on language. And over the years, as you can see, I did a very quick, this is not everything they've done, obviously, but this is just hitting some of the highlights of what they've done over the years. And you can see a systematic development of thinking around assessment and around language in Europe, culminating in 2001 with the publication of the CEFR. And then the companion volume in 2020, and then some work that a bunch of us from different organisations, including EALTA, supported for the CF Alignment Handbook and editable forms in 2022. So there's a long history of looking at language from a use perspective. The Common European Framework takes an action-based approach. We all believe, I think, in Europe that this is the right way to go. So we don't look necessarily at the bits of the language, we look at how the language is used in that context. So our idea of construct is fairly well settled. And I think a lot of that has been due to the fact that there's been quite a lot of academic and political support for that idea over the years. If you ever want to hear some really good stuff on the Council of Europe's, listen to some of David Little's work on it and read it. It's really excellent. But there's also been a professional approach that has happened, and this is probably another driver of why people think a lot of the change, a lot of the movement towards modern language testing or modern approaches to language testing is only that 20, 30, 40 years old. Because in 1989, those same organizations I mentioned earlier got together to form ALTE. And ALTE was an organization of professional bodies around Europe that has now grown, of course. It's got, 50 members or something like that. And over the years, they've contributed massively, I believe, to the professionalization of language testing in Europe at that organizational level. So they've had the ALTE framework, a multilingual glossary in 12 languages or whatever. They've had the Can Do project, the ALTE Q mark, which is a quality assurance mark, which is a very sensible way of looking at upping the quality of tests. We have the LAMI work on assessment for migrants, which has contributed massively towards our thinking in that area, and that continues to this day. Some of the guys who work on that project are here in the room. So that's been a massive change over the years in that organizations were now looking at things in a far more structured, systematic and professional way. But probably more importantly is on the professional level, on the personal level, organizations like EALTA, 20 years old this year, was the first of the professional organizations within Europe. We had ILTA before that, of course, but ALTA or EALTA focused on Europe, focused on European situation. For those of us who've been attending these conferences for 30-something years, you can see there's always traditionally been a massive difference between the ILTA conference, even when it came to Europe, and the EALTA conference. Because the EALTA conference was always far more inclusive. It was far less threatening. As somebody who was had verbal attacks at conferences, at LTRC conferences in the 1990s, when I was saying things that people didn't like to hear, they would verbally attack you during your presentation. It was mad stuff. And Neas is nodding, because we all saw it, all old enough and daft enough to have suffered through it. We always had more of a collegiality within the European approach, which reflects, I think, the theoretical thinking around construct. So I think EALTA has worked and continues, and I hope into the future will continue again, to push those boundaries and to focus, to keep our focus in Europe on that construct, because for me, that's what's critical. And not only on that construct, but our definition and understanding what that construct is and what it means. When I asked people about the past, present, and future, I got responses from about 45 people, I think. But I've included all of the areas in this. In some cases, you have Germany, North Rhine, Westphalia. You have lots of Italians. Italians must love surveys. Lorenzo, why? I don't understand it. I got more responses from Italy than any other place. It was just crazy. I had about 10 people from Italy. So, not always agreeing with each other, by the way, so, which is a very Irish perspective as well. Why have one opinion when you can have 10? But it was really valuable because it gave me an idea of what people were thinking. And so, for example, when I asked them about what languages were being tested, in the past, and it does reflect reality, that we had the vast majority of places focused on the main language of that country only. Some had others, like countries like Switzerland would have had a number of languages, obviously. Germany, Holland, various countries. But some then were very strictly just one language. You can see that's changed over the years. We are looking at more and more languages. So I wanted to know what kind of languages were being tested. And the traditional responses were, oh yeah, it's the main European languages. We kind of know that. But that wasn't enough for me. So I said, well, I better find out a little bit more. So I found this really interesting report, which showed us from 2022 what languages were accepted or expected across Europe. And this is the official list. So the ISCD, the International Standard Classification of Education, gives it primary, so lower secondary and upper secondary. So it gives you an idea, a broader picture of what's happening. Can you see that now? So it gives you an idea that many countries have one language that you must take. Some countries have none. There's no definitive language. And others have like 4. And then when you come to the ones that they may provide, the list gets even longer. So I thought, this is hilarious. I got so caught up in this yesterday. This is typical of me, panicking before my presentation. I'm going to change it. I have to say something interesting. I was even texting, poor old Neas was at on her tour of Northern Ireland yesterday, answering questions from me about the situation in Spain and Catalonia. But I then found the most hilarious one. Most countries were offering anywhere between about 4 and 14 different language options. Ireland, of course, just to be different. How many would you say options in Ireland? If you're a student in Ireland about to do your leaving cert, which is the exam at the end of your secondary school, about how many options do you think you'd have in terms of languages? Some people say 2, 1, 3, 30. And from next year, Ukrainian will be added to the list, so we'll have 31 options. That doesn't mean that all of these are tested every year, but these are approved. So if you are interested in taking one of these languages, you can apply, and they have to supply you with the test. So 31 languages. Absolute lunacy. But in Ireland, we're very good at being lunatics, as you can see. We do lunacy very well. We even have a traditional celebration on a day called Lunasa, but it does refer to the moon, but there is something in it. But 30 languages that are available. And that's kind of an interesting one, because I would reckon that list is going to continue to grow. And I think in other countries that list will begin to grow from the 4 to the 7 to the 14, because technology is going to allow us to do these things in a much more systematic and easily accessible way. But of course, other things have changed in Europe over the years. We know that at one point the focus was on a general proficiency. There wasn't a lot of focused language. We do know that in the 15th and 16th century, German apprentices were traveling to the UK to study the cotton trade. And they were studying English, but that was English for specific purposes. So that was different. In general, the focus in education was on general proficiency. And over the years, that has changed. Unfortunately, while the focus has changed, often the theoretical ideas that drive the focus haven't changed at all. They've remained the same. So people are still looking at the same old ideas. 4 skills testing, you have to do it this way, you have to test that separately. So people are still doing things in a traditional way when we know that the world around us is changing. I think that needs to change at some point. And change is the big option. Oh, in 30 minutes. I'm on time, believe it or not. I said to myself, if I can get to this slide by 30 minutes, I'm all right.
Pass the test.
I passed my own test, exactly. Mind you, I set a fairly easy bar. When you think about it. I didn't push myself too much. So when we think of change then, where do I think and where do people think that change is going to come from? Well, the most blindingly obvious thing is technology. And one of my favorite slides that I've come across in this report from last year, the survey of large language models. And this is just since 2019. These are the large language models that have appeared, and that doesn't bring us up to 2024. This is just a 4-year period. So when we're talking about large language models, we are only beginning. You know, at the AI SAG meeting yesterday, a couple of people mentioned the ChatGPT 4.0, the Omni, which is already with us. You can access a beta version of it, and that's going to change everything for us. Just that one alone. We know that ChatGPT 5 is due to come out in the next while. Everybody has been waiting for it for a while. We don't know what it's going to bring yet. But we know that Omni is claiming it can do things like, at the moment, when we have had a project in the British Council for the last year and a half or 2 years, where we're looking at creating an interactive situation where you're talking to a machine and the machine is talking back to you. It's all created using prompt engineering, and it allows you to talk to a machine in real time. So, and the machine responds to your response, not to the set responses. So it's really interesting stuff. But think about it. I have a prompt, I talk, it turns it into it records the talk, turns it into a sound wave, turns a sound wave into a text, analyzes the text, creates a response, turns it into a sound wave, turns it into a text, turns it into a sound wave, plays it back to you. And then you respond again, so time. And time is money. This new Omni is telling us it's not going to go to text anymore. It's going to go voice to voice. Which means that we will be able to have pretty well real-time conversations with the beast. That the technicians we work with call it taming the beast, trying to stop the beast going off hallucinating and doing mad stuff. So when you think about the technology and what's happening in the technology world, we know that it's going to change what we do dramatically. We know that instead of testing monologic language using computers, which we all do, Aptus is no different from anything else. And even the SDS approaches that Gary Ockey and people in the States have been looking at, those are semi-scripted, really. They're not really intuitively interactive conversations. The new technology is allowing us to do that kind of thing. It will allow us then to do real-time writing and speaking and integrated testing in a different way, adaptive testing in a different way. So we are looking at new dimensions of assessment. We have to. If we don't, we're going to be left behind. So language testing is changing, and it's going to change radically over the next few years. And part of what our work now is working not only with language testers. So I would hope that in EALTA, in the next number of years, we will have people from the tech world that we work directly with, where we're talking together. Because our worlds have to come together. They've already come together. And we have people in our team, Mariano Felice is here somewhere, and he's an AI specialist, a tech specialist. So we have people on our team now who are doing that. We wouldn't be able to build our new products without people like that. So the old days of you called some old bugger like me into your university and say, make us a test, and I'd go into a room and 3 days later come up with a test. Those are dead, man. Those are gone. Happily gone. Because now, when you're creating a test, you need a whole team of people bringing all these different levels of expertise into the table. That has got to change. If it doesn't change, we won't be able to do all these things. Because I do believe we have to reimagine assessment. We have to go back to the drawing board almost to see what can we do with this technology. Because we're no longer driven by the need to do what the technology allows us. So this concept that the computer says no is gone. And we have to accept that it's gone. If we look at what a lot of the current providers of digital assessment have all started from the technology. What will the technology allow us to do? Now let's do that. For me, I've always thought that's a wrong start. That's like, there's a very famous Irish aviator who once took off from New York to fly, this is back in the 1930s. He wanted to fly to California. He wanted to be the first person to fly across the US. He took off, he landed more or less exactly on time. Thought it was weird that he was coming in over water instead of landing looking at water. He was actually driving away from the water. He'd actually hit the storm just after takeoff and headed to Ireland by mistake. He landed in Galway. He was known for the rest of his life as Wrong Way Corrigan. If we start by asking ourselves, what can the technology allow us to do? Think about Wrong Way Corrigan. You've started looking in the wrong direction. What you need to do is to say, what do I want to do? Go back to the old European tradition of construct. What am I trying to achieve? What am I going to say about you when you've taken my test? That's where you start from. And the technology then should help you to get there. If the technology takes you off in the wrong direction, you're Wrong Way Corrigan, you've gone the wrong way. So we have to reimagine what we do. We have to reimagine how we start these projects and how we deliver these projects. And we've got to think of how we use data. We know, Ali Van Moore was telling us yesterday about how in the States already we have systems where people are using the data that people are generating in digital learning systems to help to understand where that person is and what their likely trajectory is. We're looking at already in British Council creating digital learning systems with built-in automatic assessment, essentially. So that at some point down the line, you will enter a digital learning system and you will, I hope, graduate with a certificate at a particular level from that system and you'll never take a test. You will be assessed all through your journey. Assessment measurement will never disappear. It will always be there, but you will not need a test. That day is not so far away. I hope to see it in the next 2 years. We also have to look at how technology can help improve inclusivity and accessibility. We already know that it's helping people, for example, people who can use a phone, people who are blind who can use a phone. The phone will tell them, will look at what's in front of them and tell them what's going on. So people who are deaf, we have similar support for them. Already that technology exists. What we need to do is be thinking, where is that technology going to take us? And how can we include, how can we look at, for example, we're just beginning to talk to people now about how we can use the technology to help develop assessments and learning systems for very little researched languages. So like some disappearing languages in Africa, for example, that we're hoping to set up a project relatively soon, I hope, to start looking at how the technology can help us. Once you have some data, I know we need data, but we can get it. That might keep turning itself on. I also talk about comprehensive learning systems where we integrate the different elements of the system. And I think the technology is clearly going to help us to create more standardized systems that are fully integrated. We can talk about that later if anybody has a question. What I really wanted to talk about today, validity and validation. I remember when I read this course, Jameson, 2013. Constructs are not always necessary in assessment design. I thought, good God, it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever read in my life. When you think that in my world, in what was the Steely Dan song called? Steely Dan song was called Barrytown, in Barry's world. Construct was at the center of everything you did. There was no point in doing it if you didn't have a clearly defined construct. Construct was where you started from. And I suppose I came through the European tradition, that's my helper, telling me that you start with construct and you work with construct, and everything about validity and validation is about construct. Construct is related. The construct definition is related to purpose, it's related to context, it's related to the focus. Construct isn't a simple thing, it isn't simply an ability or a trait, I believe. It's related to all of those elements. So without a construct, you don't have a test. So when I saw this is crazy stuff. But that has been a movement in the US in the validation thinking now for some time, where it's the constructless test. You think, man, where did that come from? And that got me thinking, as early as 2013. So I went back and I said, how can I present this to an audience? Right, this is a famous picture. One of my favorite artists from Ireland, a fellow called Jim Fitzpatrick. He did, if ever, anybody in my vintage will remember the poster of Che Guevara. That was very popular many, many years ago. He did that. But he also did all of these wonderful Celtic mythology pictures. And this is Grania and Diarmid. And it is from Celtic mythology, because the bit that I want you to remember from today's talk is validity, as currently envisaged, is a myth perpetuated by academics and development. As far as I'm concerned, if you walk away with no other thought or memory of today's presentation, go away with this one. Disagree with it if you like. I have no problem with you disagreeing with it. In fact, I would be really disappointed if everybody said, yeah, you're right. Because we have to accept that how we view validity is wrong. It may work for a measurement-driven approach. It does not work for a construct-driven approach. So what's a myth? So I took out the Merriam-Webster. Check it out. Look at what is number 2. I like that one. Number 3, I kind of like that one too. So it's a popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone, especially when embodying the ideals of it and institutions of a society or segment of a society. Or a person or thing having only an imaginary or unverifiable existence. And then you get some examples. Seduced by the American myth of validity, the validity myth. So that's why I think I don't think it's something that we can consciously argue that it fits with our concept of what construct means. Because we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. We can ask ourselves zillions of questions. I just cut it down to 3. Is validity primarily or only a measurement issue? Because my experience of the US tradition is that that is the case. And I was looking it up a few years back when IATA was in Dublin to have spent, first of all, a few hours in an LGRC conference with Michael Caine, and then a whole afternoon arguing with him again in Dublin about measurement. And he will say, no, my ideas are not measurement driven. But every time he gives you an example, every time you talk about something interesting, his first thought is, that would make an interesting case study. Or it always comes back to a measurement driven approach. And I'm not saying that measurement is wrong, but I'm saying that, are we right in thinking that it is the primary approach? Because certainly for the concept of construct, as we've seen it develop in Europe over the last number of centuries, it doesn't fit, because it's not a measurement approach. Measurements should support what we do. We shouldn't be doing stuff without measurement, it's crazy. But it shouldn't be the driver. Is it possible or desirable to create a constructless test? If your answer is yes, leave the room now. And the final one, which is equally complex and challenging, I guess, is, do stakeholders have a role in validation? And for me, the answer is obviously yes. If you're not engaging with your stakeholders in validation, there's no point in doing validation. That's where validation becomes a myth. Because people talk about it. People write books about it. I've written a book about it. But it doesn't actually happen. You know, I can remember one validation study that actually hits all the buttons from to say it. And that was Chappelle et al. Was that 2007 or 2009? I can't remember. I have to shut up now. So it just doesn't happen. You know, people talk about partial validation, and that's kind of saying, well, I've kind of proved it. Then they talk about using the same argument for everything, and I always like to think of it in areas like this. The world of language, particularly, is a very complex world. So when we think of a model to create a test, we have to think of all of these different elements of it, and that's where the integrated approach, I think, works. It makes sense to me, because up to now we have a validation argument. Square peg, square hole. But the problem is that we've got all these different shaped holes, but we've got the same validation argument that tends to be measurement driven. So we're trying to prove the same thing all the time using the wrong approach. It reminds me of the other problem I have, of course. The other problem I have is Toolman. People talk about Toolman. You have to use a Toolman approach. But Toolman approach it reminds me of this concept of an internal monologue. The Toolman approach is a legal approach to creating a legal argument. But if I'm in court, and Masashi here is the other lawyer, and then you're the judge, well then I'll say something, he'll object, you'll make a judgment. You guys might be the jury, you might say he's guilty, just like Mr. Trump. So, but the problem with the way we use Toolman approach in language testing, in validation studies, is I write the study, so I'm the judge, I'm the jury, I'm the solicitor, I'm the defendant, I'm everything in one. I don't know, anybody remember a film by Woody Allen from the 1970s called Bananas? There's one, you can find this on YouTube. There's one scene in it where he's actually interrogating himself as he's on the stand. It's absolutely hilariously funny. Every time I look at a Toolman argument, it reminds me of Bananas and Woody Allen. Because for me, please use Toolman, it's a great idea, but don't use it as this internal monologue. Use it by challenging other people to challenge what you've said and challenge what you've done. Then you can use Toolman in a meaningful way, and you can actually do real validation. Because real validation only happens when you have external evidence and an external voice. Now, Michelin and myself had a go at that, but I do believe that it's only a first stage, a first step. And before I finish, we'll wind back the clock to that first slide. It actually came, the inspiration for today's talk, and believe it or not, the structure of today's talk, is based on the structure of Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues, 1967. A wonderful album, please listen to it. It begins with that first line, that first paragraph, and it ends with the same one. And the critical thing, and that's what I want you to walk away with, validity is a myth, and we decide what is right and what's an illusion. And that's the challenge. Because I think what we need is a European scholarship on validity and validation from a European perspective, not from a measurement perspective. We need something new. And happily, as Douglas Adams would say, the best kind of problem to have is somebody else's problem is your problem. Thank you.
For a very interesting presentation and for finishing on time. When you said, oh good, I reached this point where I can relax now, I thought, oh no, please.
I bet you did.
But you did manage to give us. Thank you for that. We have 15 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand and the microphone will come to you.
Don't feel the need to fill the 15 minutes. There's copy away, I'm sure. Norman.
Yeah.
I knew I could depend on you for a question.
I agree with a lot of things you said, but can I sit? Yeah, I am an old man, so I can sit down. Is it on? Can you? I agree with a lot of things that you said, but when you are developing your armaments, I at a certain moment felt a little bit uneasy, because I got the impression that you have a big trust in technology. And I think that as scholars, we should have a trust in our brains and in our capacity of thinking and being creative.
Yes.
And whatever you tell, and I had yesterday also a talk about AI. Yeah, AI doesn't think. AI is not intelligence.
No.
AI is speed. Yeah, stealing others' work without paying any copyrights. And if we are not very attentive, it will take over directorship. I think we should do it. So what I missed a little bit is we should come with something new. But there, well, I miss it a little bit, and I suspect you a little bit that you trust too much in the developments of technology, and I would warn you, don't do it, because you will be disappointed.
But obviously I didn't get my message across very clearly then, because what I was trying to say is that we should use the technology, but we should be driving the technology. The technology shouldn't be driving us. And the problem that we've had up to now that I see is that a lot of the use of technology in assessment has been driven by the technology, not by the language.
Yeah, but I'm in the world a little bit longer than most of you. I have heard the same myths about the technology when the internet made its appearance, and that would solve a lot of problems. Yeah, and the only problem that it solved was to get your money in a faster and more efficient way than before.
Well, it solves somebody's problem very efficiently then.
Yeah. So I think we should be careful.
Oh yeah, I absolutely
not
agree.
to surrender to something that we do not use. Because all the things I heard yesterday was about the computer program, but not about AI. So if you want to trust AI, you should think about what AI is. And AI has its success based on the technological success of having processing huge amounts of information in a very short time. But otherwise, it's mechanical, it's stupid.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
A lot of humans are stupid as well, let's face it. but for me, any kind of technology is a machine, a tool that you can use. And in the same way as you'll remember better than me, back in the late 80s, early 90s, when you were trying to run facets, for example, on an old DOS machine, and you start your analysis on a Thursday, because if you did it on Friday, it would stop at some stage, and then you'd come into work on Monday and you'd have nothing, you'd have to start again. So you start on Thursday, and usually if it was still running on Friday, you thought, yeah, it'll be okay. And then by the time you got into work on Monday, or maybe Tuesday morning, it would have finished the analysis. And then you got your analysis, and you got to look at the output. And I remember looking at that. I was teaching a course in Reading at one stage, and I got a new laptop, and I found my old DOS program. And I said to the lads, you know, this used to take 5 days to run. Let's see how long it takes. Before I could finish the sentence, 27 seconds, it had finished. So the technology is there, and I think we're crazy not to use it. But we can't assume that the technology is always going to be right. But we have to drive it. I think that's the point I'm making. We drive it. We don't say to the technology, you do it. We say to the technology, you do what we want you to do. But you have to question it. It's like what I said at the beginning. Always question. So you're right to question it. I absolutely agree. You're right to question it.
Thanks very much, Barry. Not about technology. One thing that you mentioned in your talk was the development of possibly systems that assess learners as they go and give them a grade or a score or feedback without being tested.
Yeah.
Do you think that in the future, and maybe this is a naive question, there'll be less testing?
Well, as we increase our use of digital learning systems, of course. And they exist at the moment. There are systems that exist at the moment, but they're quite primitive. And again, primarily driven by measurement. And that measurement isn't enough. We need other ways of understanding how people are achieving levels of proficiency in language and how they can demonstrate it. And it's not just down to measurement. You have to be able to measure. So you have to have a clear language model, and you have to have a clear measurement model to understand what you're doing. If you don't, you can't measure anything. But I do think, I'd be very surprised if we don't see more meaningful systems in the next 2 years. Like, you know yourself, we're working on something ourselves in the British Council where we already have a set of assessments in place in a digital learning environment, but we're not doing making judgmental decisions. We're making developmental decisions only and giving feedback. But the technology is there, it allows us to do it. It's not easy and it's not cheap, but it does allow us to do it, and that already exists. So it's only a matter of time before it happens. And we'd be crazy not to. You know, tests are hard. A lot of people really, my older brother Mark was far more intelligent than I was. He never did very well in his exams because he was absolutely petrified. He would be physically sick the night before a test. I'd be out playing football. Of course, he did a lot better than me in the test, but fair enough. I just didn't care, it didn't bother me. So we have to understand that how we test and what we test and why we test. It's not going to work for everybody. We have to think of all of the different people that are out there. And if we can create accurate systems to make judgments about people based on their performance over time, why wouldn't you do it? It doesn't make sense not to do it. So, yeah.
Just a quick question to follow up that. If developmental assessment is going to be digitalized, what's going to happen to teaching and learning? What's going to happen to classrooms? You know, what is the impact of this digital prolonged assessment system on, let me not say learning, but teaching? You know, what's going to happen to teaching? Thank
Teaching
you.
has to change. So teaching, when you think about it, we created learning systems in the late 19th century for a society that was appropriate at that time. We're now 150 years into it and we're still doing the same thing. We have the same kind of classes, the same kind of instruction, the same kind of teaching, essentially. Things have changed, have improved, I hope. But we're working with a system that's really not fit for purpose. So we do need to change the system. Education systems are desperately slow to change. So we do have to look at it. I don't see that teachers' jobs will be affected. I don't think you can learn without human intervention. I think you can do other things without human intervention. But you do need the human contact. So I believe that we'll still need teachers. There's a doomsday scenario that I see that as education becomes industrialized, that large tech companies will move into education. And when that happens, they'll provide education for the masses through technology. And then the people who can afford it will have real teachers and the technology. And the people who can't afford it will have the technology. And then the divide in society will grow even more. So, but again, we have to be careful, and as Norman says, we have to question the machines. We can't let the machines dictate. We can see what they can add to the system, but we can't let them run the system. Like, theoretically, I've been thinking about this for a number of years now. Like, theoretically, we're not far away from a system where we could develop, and certainly on a theoretical level, I know it can be done because I thought about it. We could develop self-generating learning and assessment systems where there's no human intervention. We're not far off from the technology. We could do it on a sort of beta level now. We're not far off the technology, but that would be a massively worrying step, I think, to take. We have to be very, very careful about that. And it's the industrialization of learning is a real problem. That we have to keep, as academics and as people, as thinkers, we have to always question that, because without humans, there isn't any point. There's a really good book, by the way, and I keep it with me all the time. I have it back in my room. It's called Artificial Intelligence for the Thinking Human. I'm thinking by a woman called Melanie Mitchell, written a couple of years ago, but it's still really fantastic because it tells you what it is and what it really is. You know, this is what the machine is really doing. You know, you see it. OpenAI will give you a demonstration of this is the new ChatGPT 4 Omni. It can do this, and if you look at the presentations, it can do wow. You think this is going to do everything. But this book actually goes back into it even goes into the maths if you want to read the maths behind it. But it tells you how it works, but it also tells you how it's being used. It's a really interesting book, quite a big one, but well worth a read. Melanie Mitchell. Anybody who ever thinks of playing around with AI should read it because it makes you think.
We can take one more question, but don't leave afterwards just yet because there's some housekeeping.
Yeah, but hand in the back.
Well, thank you for the presentation, Barry, very interesting. I wanted to follow up on your validity is a myth. Would you say that validation is a myth as well, after having talked about Tolmin's model and how we could externalize Tolmin's model and use other people's feedback?
Well, the validation is even a greater myth because you don't see it happen. And it drives me crazy looking at these partial validation studies. Like I really like the Keynes idea of like with your chain of arguments, you build your chain. But anybody who knows anything knows that a chain is as strong as its weakest link. And if you then say, well, I'm not actually going to put that link in at all. I'm only going to look at this bit, this bit, and this bit. Well, that's not an argument. That's not going to convince me at all. That's not a validation argument. So the concept of partial validation is crazy.
So what's the alternative?
I don't know.
Okay. Backlog probably.
But I do have an idea of where it should go, because I think we need to understand, again, go back to the construct. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? Who am I doing it with and to? And in what context? And then you look at the people who you're talking to. One of my big problems with the whole validation approach at the moment is that it's written by academics for academics, or lawyers. You know, I had a really interesting meeting the other day. I'm talking at a conference in London next week, and one of the guys on the panel, he's actually a lawyer in the States. And his whole role is working for assessment companies in the US, defending them basically. That's his job. And for me, it's really interesting. We don't kind of have that kind of stuff over here so much. But when you look at what they do in terms of the approaches to validation, they're so narrow. The arguments are so narrow. And when we think about it, they're written for such a narrow audience. But a validation argument should be accessible in some way, at some level, by everybody. At the moment, we in this social cognitive model, I always put a list of potential stakeholders. At the moment, we write these validation arguments for maybe one or two groups of stakeholders, and that's all. And screw everybody else. Whereas what we need to do is look at all of our stakeholder groups. Who are the key stakeholder groups? And how am I going to convince them that my test is doing what it should do? So validation for me is far more complicated in one way and far simpler in another way. And it really boils down to your ability to communicate. If you can communicate your argument to people, you're then going to convince them. There's a really interesting study done by Rio Koizumi and David Allen in Japan recently, where they looked at why a particular test had been perceived by press, by society in general as failing. And when they looked at it, they took a social cognitive approach, looking at all the different perspectives, and they found that the failure was down to communication from every different perspective. So really, that's what we need to be looking at. We need to be understanding how can we best communicate to appropriate audiences. And academics and lawyers are just one. It has to be, we have to look further. And that's a challenge, of course it's a challenge. And maybe we're not the best people to be doing it. You know, we need communications specialists to work with us. But we need, in the same way as we need to control the technology, we need to control them as well, because, you know, marketing people tend to invent stuff. They hallucinate just like ChatGPT did. So we have to rein them in.
Thank you, Barry.
That's all.